Hello, this is John Bodden, historian at Oregon State University, and today we're going to review the history of Prohibition in the United States, what happened, why it ended, and the ramifications. Prohibition, sometimes called the Noble Experiment, refers to the period in American history from 1920 to 1933 when it was illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages. Not surprisingly, Prohibition was a massive shakeup for the American brewing industry. Most breweries did not survive, and for those that did, a handful went on to achieve stunning national growth by mid century. Once common beer styles, such as porter and pale ale, practically disappeared in the aftermath of Prohibition, and more generally, the experiment remains a source of debate about the role of government in society, personal freedom, and the social problems arising from substance abuse. All right, let's begin. January 17, 1920, that's the date when the Volstead Act went into effect, banning the sale and manufacture of beer, liquor, and wine in every part of the United States. The law stated that it was legal to own and consume alcoholic beverages purchased before January 17, 1920. Priests, pastors, and rabbis were permitted to dispense sacramental wine, and doctors could prescribe medicinal whiskey for patients with aches and pains. The Volstead Act established the Bureau of Prohibition to enforce the new law. Its agents had the authority to conduct raids and enforce prohibition across state lines. When Prohibition began in 1920, there were about 500 breweries in operation. Most of the smaller breweries ceased operations forever. The large breweries tried to keep their plants in operation and by making whatever products they could. Jacob Rupert, the largest brewer in New York City and owner of the New York Yankees, tried to challenge the Volstead Act's definition of an intoxicating beverage. The brewers, and he represented other brewers, argued that beer with a 2.75 alcohol content by weight did not lead to drunkenness. Well, Wayne Wheeler of the Anti Saloon League countered with his own set of statistics, expert witnesses, and case histories. The Volstead Act defined the threshold for an intoxicating beverage at 0.5% alcohol by volume, and this was the figure that the Supreme Court of the United States upheld in the court case Rupert versus Caffey in January 1920. So Jacob Rupert had no choice but to transition from the sale of beer to malt beverages with 0.5% alcohol, his Knickerbocker beverage. He also refocused on the Yankees, and in 1920 he acquired the services of Babe Ruth. That was a good business decision, and the Yankees became perennial champions of the American League. In Milwaukee, Schlitz introduced its own malt beverage, as did several other brewers. Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis made ginger ale. Some brewers used their refrigeration machinery to make ice. Pabst marketed a malt tonic. Yuengling in Pennsylvania specialized in ice cream in particular. Pabst developed a cheese spread. Others sold ice as a secondary product. The smallest brewers, as you might imagine, would shut down, never to reopen. Bevo was a non-alcoholic malt beverage produced by Anheuser-Busch of St. Louis before and during Prohibition. The idea originated in 1908 when Adolphus Busch directed his chief chemist to develop a cereal beverage with a beer flavor and without alcohol. Anheuser-Busch introduced Bevo in 1916, just before World War I, and hoped to capitalize on the U.S. Armed Forces banning alcoholic beverages in the barracks. First 6 months after it was introduced, Anheuser-Busch shipped 2.2 million cases of Bevo, and at the peak of its popularity in the early 1920s, Anheuser-Busch sold more than 5 million cases. Sales declined precipitously after that, and Anheuser-Busch discontinued the drink in 1933. One thing the history of Bevo reveals is that brewers were thinking about how to produce non-alcoholic drinks well before Prohibition went into effect, because dry laws were advancing at the state level, and American consumers, for their part, generally rejected these malt drinks in favor of ginger ale or sodas like Coca-Cola. Young American women challenged cultural norms by cutting their hair short, wearing form-fitting clothes, and seeking greater economic independence. For American women who wanted a drink, it meant going to illegal speakeasies. And here was one major criticism of the 18th Amendment in that it fostered a widespread disregard for established law. Millions of people who wanted to drink did just that despite prohibition. Some people obtained wine under the guise of religious use for Jewish or Christian rituals, but the simplest way to circumvent the Volstead Act was actually to make wine at home. Vintners in California began dehydrating grape juice into bricks with instructions to add 1 gallon of water and benzoate of soda to prevent fermentation. As you might guess, millions of Americans were decidedly not adding benzoate of soda to prevent the grape juice from becoming alcoholic. One research paper about alcohol in the 1920s shows that per capita consumption fell dramatically in 1921, the first year, and then it shot back up. While Americans did not drink as much booze as they had in 1910, they were clearly still drinking. The Volstead Act did not dramatically cut consumption over the long term. However, what Americans drank changed markedly. Distilled spirits such as whiskey and gin were easier to get, conceal, transport, and consume. Beer, despite its low alcohol content compared to liquor and wine, was less widely consumed due to its volume, the space it takes up, while the overconsumption of unsafe liquors increased. In fact, hospitals had more cases of alcohol poisoning during Prohibition than before it. One judge in Manhattan remarked, "Prohibition is a joke. It has deprived the poor working man of his beer, and it has flooded the country with rat poison." Indeed, liquor consumption went up, as did the number of people trying to make the stuff in their homes or using illegal sills in the countryside. Bathtub gin refers to any style of homemade spirit made in amateur conditions. And here we see these amateur sills captured by the Bureau of Prohibition. So the 18th Amendment did not stop people who wanted a drink from drinking. Instead, control of the liquor trade fell into criminal hands. Italian-American mobster Al Capone got very rich in the 20s by smuggling liquor into the city of Chicago from supply points in Canada and by drawing on his legal operations domestically. But he was not the only one doing it. There was big money to be made by those willing to break the law. And criminal gangs fought over territory, and mob violence increased during the 1920s. Bootleggers in the South used the Appalachian Mountains to manufacture their liquor and fast cars to transport it into cities. In western states like Oregon, illegal production of liquor was concentrated in the hills and mountains of the Cascade and coastal zones near the population centers of the Willamette Valley. Per capita murder rates went up across the country, and public officials felt like they did not have the resources to control the emerging criminal element. In 1928, the U.S. presidential election occurred between Al Smith, a Democrat and wet politician who spoke about repealing the 18th Amendment, and Herbert Hoover, a Republican and dry politician. Well, Hoover won. His party was rewarded for the strong economy of the 1920s that was presided over by his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge, and for proponents of prohibition, it seemed like a validation of the 18th Amendment. Americans had had a chance to vote for a wet politician in Al Smith, but they voted for Hoover. That takes us to 1929. There were arguments for maintaining prohibition after 10 years of the experiment, that alcohol consumption was down compared to 1915. The economy was stronger because of prohibition. Proponents noted that there were fewer industrial accidents in the 1920s. They also said the law hadn't had a chance to work. It needed a little more time. And there was an acknowledgement of the criminal element that had emerged in bootlegging. So they called for stepped up enforcement, right? More money for the Bureau of Prohibition. And ultimately, they said the morality of prohibition was sound. It was a positive for families and society as a whole. Well, there were arguments. There were strong arguments, too, for repealing prohibition. Those who favored repeal pointed that the murder rate was up, while tax revenue was down. Prohibition reflected a rural religious bias. More people supported it in the countryside than in the city. And enforcement was expensive, and as people could see, increasingly ineffectual. Prohibition, many said, assaulted individual liberty and cultural preferences. And finally, prohibition decreased respect. This is what was said. It decreased respect for law. It made rule breakers out of millions of people. And it had a corrupting influence on state institutions, meaning that there were lots of cops and politicians who took bribes from organized criminals. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the murder of 7 Irish gangsters by Al Capone's gang in Chicago in 1921. The massacre shocked the public for several reasons. It occurred during broad daylight. The victims were lined up against a wall and murdered using Thompson submachine guns by assailants disguised as police officers. Well, the Grisly massacre fed a public view that the Volstead Act had led to lawlessness, corruption, and violence arising from the illegal traffic in liquor. U.S. President Herbert Hoover called for a federal commission on problems related to the Volstead Act, and the event also influenced growing public opinion that the 18th Amendment needed modification or repeal. The Wickersham Commission was the federal commission that was tasked with examining problems related to the Volstead Act. President Herbert Hoover appointed a former Attorney General, George Wickersham, pictured here, to head the commission, and its report, the final report made public in January 1931, is noteworthy. 7 of the 11 commissioners called for major revisions of the Volstead Act. 2 called for the immediate repeal of prohibition, and 2 recommended retaining prohibition without changes. It's a significant moment for revealing the waning support for prohibition inside of the federal government. Women for Prohibition Reform was an organization formed in the late 1920s by women opposed to the continued ineffectual enforcement of prohibition in the United States. This group, like many others, emerged as a reaction to the negative consequences of prohibition, including the rise of organized crime, increased illegal alcohol production and distribution, and the general disregard for law. But one thing that really took the wind out of public support for prohibition was the economic crisis we know as the Great Depression. Following the stock market crash in October 1929, the American economy did not recover. Quite the opposite. Banks failed, people lost their homes and livelihoods, global trade collapsed, and the rate of national unemployment surged above 20%. From an economic point of view, it did not seem rational to keep funding the Bureau of Prohibition or give up the needed federal excise taxes on alcoholic beverages. Breweries before 1920 had been major sources of employment, and the country needed jobs. This cartoon illustrates a popular point of view as we see legal beer embracing the public with Congress overseeing the embrace. In 1932, at the peak of the crisis, 73.5% of respondents to a nationwide poll in Literary Digest magazine favored repeal of prohibition. Public opinion had decisively shifted, and the great social experiment was perceived as a failure. 2 months after the Literary Digest poll, the mayor of New York City, James J. Walker, organized a We Want Beer parade. It took place on May 14th, 1932, and featured thousands of participants carrying banners and signs demanding the legalization of beer and the repeal of the 18th Amendment. The parade showed how unpopular prohibition had become in the context of economic hardship. The mayor, James Walker, said, quote, fully 50 million people would welcome a tax on beer, end quote. He also wanted to curtail the criminals that controlled the liquor traffic in his city. With the 1932 presidential election in November, Americans had a clear choice between wet and dry tickets. Herbert Hoover and his running mate Charles Curtis favored maintaining the 18th Amendment, while Democrats Franklin Roosevelt and John Garner favored immediate repeal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt unequivocally favored repeal of prohibition as the Democratic candidate in the 1932 presidential election. He defeated the incumbent dry candidate Herbert Hoover, and the Democratic Party took control of Congress, creating a unified government. After FDR's inauguration in January 1933, he promised bold, swift action to deal with the economic crisis. One part of this program involved getting people back to work, and that meant legalizing wineries, distilleries, and breweries. On February 20th, Congress proposed the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, repealing the 18th Amendment. The Beer and Wine Revenue Act was a law passed by the new Democratic Congress in 1933 that legalized beverages with an alcohol strength of no more than 3.2% alcohol by weight. The idea was to modify the Volstead Act by defining anything less than 3.2% non-alcoholic. Well, the law went into effect on April 7th, 1933. The temperance movement had suffered a dramatic reversal of fortunes. So beer was re-legalized, near beer that is, on April 7th. It was called New Beer Day, and FDR famously said it was a good time to have a beer. Anheuser-Busch and other breweries sent cases of beer to the White House in appreciation. In Seattle and other cities, the beer supply failed to meet public demand, but it wasn't all peaches and roses for the brewing industry. Many Americans did not like 3.2% beer, and besides, the excise taxes were higher. They were higher than before. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified by the states, and FDR called on Americans to purchase alcoholic beverages only from licensed dealers and practice moderate drinking, while individual states and counties still had the right to maintain dry laws. Breweries could finally produce strong beer or full-strength stuff at or above 5%. In the next lecture, we'll discuss the legacies of Prohibition. It had a profound impact on the American brewing industry. A great number of counties established blue laws or remained completely dry. Kansas prohibited alcohol until 1948 and prohibited bars from dispensing liquor until 1987. In other words, the issue went back to the states, and in the present day, there are still completely dry counties, especially in the state of Arkansas. As we leave this topic, it's worth pausing to ask what the lessons of Prohibition are for our time.